Okay, thank you very much, Matthew, for the introduction. I'm very pleased to be here, and I've heard a lot of points that, during the whole of today, which actually add into the presentation I'm going to give, which is entitled "Where Are the Dead?" I'll come back to those, what I've heard and how I think it fits in a moment. Now, I've posed this question, where are the dead? Because I think it's something that is likely to be pondered by many bereaved people at some time or other, perhaps not directly, but through many, many proxy questionings, such as, I wonder how he is, I wonder, is he in a better place? Are they happy? Are they comfortable? Are they bored? Are they lonely? These kind of intermediate questions, which are not the big profound questions like where are the dead, but I think they contribute to this idea that the destinations of the dead are ever present in the lives and thinking, particularly the thinking of bereaved people who have been closer to the dead in life. Researching aspects of the material culture of death and disposal over the past decade or more, it is hard to avoid the evidence that the living make efforts through mourning activity, the detail of mourning activity, not just to remember the dead, but to engage with them and to even to divert and entertain them. And I'll come back to that again if there's time. I'm suggesting that this engagement with the dead is something that underpins and is key to interpreting much mourning activity, and that it is this tiny detail, the kind of detail that we've been hearing about today. And I've made a very quick list. We've heard about the type of stone that is used, the colour of the stone, the shapes of the stone, the images, the inscriptions, the type of the lettering that is used. We've heard about the detail of ironwork, the flowers, the flower arrangements, the pre-burial wakes and what goes on with those, and why that might be more important in some places than the post-burial activities, meeting the ancestors, the blue lights that signal the forthcoming of death. Not all of you will have heard these talks, but I heard these ones today. And I think these are the kind of details, the mourning details, from which the bereaved, as they are evolving their mourning practices, and these are not just restricted to the moment of burial or the preparation for burial, they are ongoing activities that take place at the grave and elsewhere. And there are always minute choices to make about the shape of the stone, the colour of the stone. So it's this kind of detail that I'm going to refer to and that I have in mind. I'm going to skip quite a few bits because I'm sure we're quite short of time. And actually, I was just thinking I've got the beyond the graveyard shift, actually. So I'm putting forward this suggestion that mourning activity is underpinned by the private and personal ways in which individuals struggle to contemplate the absence of someone who's been close in life, and to become more or less reconciled to the idea that nothing, at least of what was formerly known and experienced, that nothing is left. That the bereaved are uneasy where the dead are invisible and cannot be remembered unless the living somehow or other make a place for them. This remembrance, I want to say, is not only engendered through the public aspects we see in the cemetery and elsewhere out of the cemetery. Rather, these materialities allow a gradual unfolding for mourners of realizations about death. We witness the formal public places, but the patterns of thinking about death, out of which these formal manifestations of mourning are engendered, I think the origins of those are evident in the offerings from ironmonger, forgers, stonemasons, etc. What is not evident is the way in which commemoration arises out of what I'd like to make a case for as the iterative connection between this detail of mourning activity, the choices people make, and the struggles that they make to have some conception of an afterlife. And I want to go on to say that there is a very close connection between the choice of these details that constitute mourning and mourning activity and the ideas that people can develop in their own minds and think about as they are choosing, as they are putting together a composition of mourning. I'll give some examples of this in a moment. But as an anthropologist, more often than not working alongside other anthropologists, I've been drawn to interpret our research findings in ways that have entailed sorting out the patterns of thinking that may underlie material culture. In this instance, the cerebral imagining of afterlife, of otherworldly destinations, and the otherwise highly abstract phenomena of death. So I'm saying that people are tackling this really difficult area by putting things together, by assembling them, and that this, in aggregate, constitutes the big public manifestations of mourning that we see in the cemetery. Insofar as the ethnographic material I'm going to mention is concerned, and how it might support this idea that mourning arises from these individual thought forms as to where the dead might be, I think it might enhance our understanding of the public forms if we understand the minutiae of these individual compositions. Now, I've only got 15 minutes at the most in which to get through this. Perhaps not that.
20.
Oh, okay. So I will draw very sparingly on two sets of research findings. Let me just outline what they are. One of them concerned burial in cemeteries, and we, at the time, it's about 10, 15 years ago, we concentrated only on cemeteries and burial. We didn't at that time move into what was happening in cremation. In that project, we looked at London cemeteries, and we approached people in cemeteries. We ended up approaching a lot of people and asked them about their visit to the cemetery that day. And then we were at the graveside, and we had discussions with them about the grave, how it came to be how it was, the choices they had made, and the meanings that might be contained within the choices, for instance, of stone and inscription. The second project I'll draw on briefly is one that I did with colleagues some years later, and there we were interested in what people were doing with the ash remains that increasingly are removed from crematoria in the UK, at least, and in other parts of Europe. Not, I think, so much in Ireland, but people, the legislation in the UK is such that people can do pretty much what they like with these ashes once they've taken them away from the crematoria. So, you know, it raised very interesting questions about what people were choosing to do. Were they inventing new ritual, or what were they doing? So those two research projects I'll draw briefly upon. Now, I acknowledge that the data I'm touching upon has been collected in UK settings and in cultural milieu that may be very different to those characteristic elsewhere. But at the same time, the possibility of breaking from traditional or established cultural patterns must, at all periods, have been incipient in the ways private concerns about the dead became manifest in public ways. And it's certainly the case now that individual or personal concerns can certainly run counter to publicly approved ways of thinking about an afterlife. Just a comment about beliefs, customs and practices. I think we can say that they persist for many reasons, and not least because they are experienced as effective, in this instance for grieving, for mourning, for remembering, as well as for managing death. Such long-standing templates for coping with death and loss can nevertheless come to be experienced as unfitting in certain ways and be edged out of practice by reconfigured strategies. And this pattern is already very evident in the UK. This question about where are the dead, where did people think the dead are? I'm just very briefly going to skip through a massive material to say the range of comments went from they're nowhere, they've gone, I don't know, I hope he's in heaven. That was surprisingly infrequent. And I'm really talking about thousands of encounters across these two studies. Some might say something along the lines of, I know where the body is, but I don't know where the person is. Others might say, well, they're at the cemetery, it's the place to leave them, isn't it? Others began to make rather closer to home comments. They would say things like, this grave is her new home, and I visit and I clean and I visit and I bring presents, just as I would have done when she was alive, about her mother or sister. The question, how are the dead, seems in a way to be coming more into focus than where they are. The idea that they're free, that they're released, seems to be increasingly prominent, and this may be because of the greater predominance of ash disposal, certainly in England, in the UK. How are the dead? Are they occupied in their familiar hobbies? That's frequently referenced. You know, I hope that he's got a garden there. Things like comments like that. I hope she is reunited with other kin. These views apply to both burial and ash remains. An obvious point to make, though, is that with burial, only some decisions can be deferred, whereas when people have got the ash remains and they're at home pondering, sometimes for years, what to do with them, they can defer most decisions except that of cremation. But since mourning activity is something that can carry on for a long time, whether the decisions are deferred or not, mourning activity is something that may be materially refreshed and renewed as mourners carry, and it may also be cognitively refreshed and renewed as mourners carry on thinking about what to do with ashes. So it is an ongoing process. It involves materialities and involves thinking and this iterative task. Now, I missed something. Just one of the things I want to say is that quite a lot of the comments that people made suggested that aspects of memorialisation were coded, that there were meanings in the inscriptions, in the stones, that were not immediately evident. And I just want to give one quick example of this. In relation to a burial, a widow was visiting the grave of her husband, and the conversation, the discussion went the usual way. What are you doing here today? It's, you know, how does the stone come to be like this? And the stone was red Aberdeen granite, and it was quite a big stone. It had a sort of dividing line down the middle of it, vertically. One side of it was rough, was a very rough finish. The other side was very smooth. And the inscription went across both these sides. And that was a curiosity. I didn't do the interview, someone else did. And it raised a question, why have you chosen that? And the woman said, well, she said, as a child I had polio, which means I have one hand that really cannot do anything very much. But my other hand did all the work. And she said, and that was something that my husband always commented on. Now, this was a decision about this detail I'm talking about that was not made during the couple's life. It was something she had thought about for 2 or 3 years, and she had decided to incorporate the embodied nature of their relationship, of their marriage, within the stone. And it's that kind of detail that I think goes into mourning activity that often we cannot understand, and for archaeology it's perhaps more difficult to understand and comprehend. But how does this kind of question relate to the question of where are the dead? I want to say that if it is the case that these many detailed and eloquent statements about identities of the surviving self and the deceased other, if these are expressed through the material and the ephemeral to represent a frame for depicting how lives were shared, it appears that they are also used imaginatively as a frame within which the question, where are the dead or where are they now, can be posed and struggled with, especially since reuniting is frequently spoken of in a future afterlife. It's this crafting of a shared territory that perhaps bridges the worlds of the living and the dead through this detail, this iterative detail, the thinking that goes on and the doing, that allows negotiation in a quasi-participative way with the dead. And that's the first of two themes that have emerged out of the material that I've tried to interpret. The second has to do with attributions of agency on the part of the dead, by which I mean that the dead are acting independently or supposedly independently of the living. As this woman says, of visits to her husband's grave, she says, when I talk to him there, I tell him things that happen. And then she adds, actually, I think they know already, which suggests something else going on that she can guess about, but she's not quite sure about. Another instance, very quickly. After a 2-year interval, with his father's ashes stored in a wardrobe in the spare room at home, a son suggested that his father was only sometimes present with his now scattered ashes. These ashes had gone to a dog track in his father's distant home, in his home city, and it was a place where he, the father, had reportedly experienced many good times, sometimes with the son. And the son says, I think of Dad as pretty nearby him, the son. I don't think of him as there at the dog track. And then he says, and it's another, I think, suggestion of the dead having agency, he can be there if he wants, but I don't think he's there all the time. This suggestion that the father can be somewhere else, can go where the father wishes to go, was common for burials as well. But in this case, the son seemed to be indicating that his dead father was able to choose how to conduct himself as independent and moving around, to be present at different times with different people and in places that had been his life world. When the son describes the dog track as somewhere where his father can be if he wants, we glimpse something of the way bereaved individuals and family may be trying to ensure that options for the dead remain open, because the living have to concede that the state of being dead is unimaginable, though as survivors and at certain level they acknowledge its reality. So it's this juggling with reality and the impossibility really of imagining, but wishing to do good by the dead and leave the options open, because only the dead can know what the state of dead is like. I'm going to skip over and just very briefly illustrate a second case, which I think supports this idea, the son and the dog track and his father. A grandson expressed very similar ideas about his dead grandmother. A family decision, this is in relation to ashes, a family decision had evolved over time to scatter her ashes at a particular spot on the hillside, which had a sight line to her former home. This house was now owned by strangers, but the grandfather's, that's her husband's, ashes had been scattered in the garden years earlier. Now, this grandson reflected that the family, after a period of a couple of years, had made a decision. He said, we went there a lot as a family. It's a nice place to be, that's independent. But obviously, he says, obviously, she could overlook my granddad, and then at least they could see each other. And then he adds again, if they actually still wanted to see each other, it's like the dog track. If the dad wants to be at the dog track, okay. If he wants to be somewhere else with his pals reunited, that's okay. So I think this conception that the dead must be given options in the mode of disposal, in the memorializations that take place, is also common in this. I'm going to do some skipping here. And I think it suggests that the kind of thinking patterns that may well be going on, and indeed are endorsed by many of the details that we picked up in conversations, ethnographic conversation with people, that as they're arranging or deciding what to plant on the grave next year, they're thinking back into the past, into shared pasts, and they're creating terrain that, in a sense, in a metaphysical sense, the living come to share, but with the dead, because in thinking about the memorials, they have taken into account the details of former lives, as well as this concern about leaving the options for the dead open. So I'm arguing, first of all, there is this shared terrain during which, in very momentary instances, the living can cross and have an imaginative stab at what the long-term state of being dead entails. So I'll conclude, because I think my time must be nearly up. It seems that mourning activity is often a creative rather than a predetermined process. And it's also participative in the sense that I've described. And also that over a long period of mourning, new factors will intervene and will need to be negotiated. And where the mourner, the chief mourner if you like, feels that it's appropriate to be incorporated in future mourning practices. This may be particularly prominent when we're looking at, as we did, the quite long intervals that could elapse between people retrieving the ashes from the crematoria and making decisions and then enacting the decisions. But as I've already hinted at, I think post-burial mourners dealing with graves or even with ash graves, they continue to evolve their thinking and evolve their patterning of material mourning. There's an attempt to achieve a kind of balance between what the deceased person would have wanted, sometimes what the mourners report they said they wanted or did not want, and what survivors are able practically and emotionally to accomplish. This can take time to work out. Removing ashes for later disposal was a choice which set many bereaved people on an open path of indeterminate direction and length. The materiality entailed in all disposals, however, including burial, allows this creation of a shared territory at what we might call the frontiers of life and death, which allows the living to approach, to skirt around, to enter momentarily, rather than to comprehend the state of being dead. These may be very fleeting glimpses of an afterlife that people may secure, but they serve to direct mourning activity in directions that may console because they are fitting. And I want to just say, by way of conclusion, something about the idea of the disposal and the memorialization being fitting. And we use this term fitting meaning respectful, that it should fit. But I think there are many things that need to fit for the disposal, and along with the memorialization and commemoration that accompanies a disposal, that makes the idea of fitting important. I think the living can fit their ponderings about death generally, but death of their closely associated family member. They can fit these ponderings with their detailed commemorative choices and activities. And as they do so, with this fit, they can continue to evolve their thinking and their doing, and in this particular space of time where the thinking and doing is going on. And in doing this, it seems that they make the abstract idea of death available to the senses, not just to abstract reflection. They're touching, they're handling, they're planting, they're smelling, they're remembering, they're choosing, the range of things that can be chosen from the short list I mentioned earlier. The dead are envisaged as having agency in their afterlives in ways that the living can recognize and interact with in their thinking and their gestures of remembrance, that also entail the creation of the shared terrain composed of past memories and future patternings that may unfold over time, formed by the passages and the transitions undergone by the dead as they are contemplated in their death. I'll finish there.